Good evening. As promised, tonight we will start again with the 8 covenants of the Bible, as you can see. And in my opinion, when we come to foundational principles, something very critical to understand. The reason for that is that a lot of people view the Bible in dispensations, and dispensationalism sometimes could be a very dangerous thing when it comes to interpretation and correct exegesis. What is important is that we view the covenants, and in all fairness, the covenants are linked to certain time periods or dispensations, but many of these covenants were throughout the Bible, 8 of them in particular, are not necessarily concluded, but are eternal covenants and will be fulfilled and concluded at the coming of the Messiah. And those are the things we need to have a look at. The most important thing when we do look at covenants is to understand that God relates to man via covenants. And we need to understand that. How do these covenants work? Well, we're going to see today that some of them are conditional and others unconditional, and as Gentiles all need to understand where they fit in to these covenants, because one of the things I've noticed, if you don't understand the covenants, you can get quickly deceived. For example, there are people who misquote the scriptures and would tell you that God divorced Israel and all his covenants with Israel are therefore null and void. And the church replaces Israel, and they believe in something called replacement theology. And then they try and make applicable to themselves the scriptures of the Old Testament, which are applicable only to Israel. And if they understood the covenants correctly, you would not have movements like the Hebrew roots movement, where people firmly believe as Gentiles that they are part of that covenant and that they must bring themselves under that covenant of works and in the process become enemies of Christ. So, I think it's critical that we understand again what 2 Timothy 2:15 says, study to show yourself approved before God as workmen who do not need to be ashamed, who rightly divide the word of truth. Understanding the covenants is going to help you rightly divide the word of truth. I wrote there at the bottom, although the dispensations may come to an end, covenants themselves often continue. There are unconditional covenants which are everlasting covenants, and we'll see that tonight as we begin with them. Now, to start off with, conditional covenants. What are those? Well, they're bilateral. In other words, between two parties, both parties into that agreement, and they both have to agree on the terms, and they have to comply to the terms of that bilateral agreement. God promises to grant special blessings to man, providing man fulfills certain conditions contained in the covenants. For example, the covenant made with Moses at Mount Sinai, or through Moses with the people. It is a conditional covenant. If you do this, then you'll have this. It's conditional. They have to keep the Sabbath as a sign. They have to be circumcised. These are all signs of a conditional covenant, and then there are consequences for breaking the covenant. Man's failure to do so often results in punishment. It's conditional with certain very negative results if you break it. One's response to the covenant agreement brings either blessing or cursing when it comes to conditional. It relies on man's participation. Then you get unconditional covenants. Now, the unconditional covenant is a unilateral covenant and is a sovereign act of God. Now, something that very few people understand is that God gave a covenant through Jesus Christ, which is a sovereign act of God based purely on his attributes and character to reconcile ourselves with him through faith and not by works. It's called the New Covenant or the Renewed Covenant. And it was never given to the church. It was given to Israel. And I'll show you in the covenants how that works. And we understand that it is unilateral purely based on the character of God, His mercy, compassion, kindness, goodness, and grace. It's a one-way street. Okay? He unconditionally obligates Himself to bring to pass certain blessings. I should have highlighted that. The Lord says, I will, which declares God's determination to do as He promises. It relies purely on His integrity and character. Now, what is important is to understand that there are 6 covenants in the Bible that are unconditional. Those would be the Adamic covenant, the Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, okay, the Palestinian or land covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the new covenant. What is important about these covenants would be for you to understand practically, well, how does that apply to me? What is still in existence? Which of these covenants, which of these promises are still in working order and perpetuating itself today, which are still applicable? Right. Because that's what we are really interested in, right? Now, what is important is the following. There are 8 covenants, but 5 of the 8 covenants were made exclusively with Israel. And this is so beautiful, and it's such a disappointment for those who believe in replacement theology. We're going to look at the new covenant and the renewed covenant, where the church will clearly have to learn, according to Romans 9, Romans 10, that the covenants and the promises were made to the people Israel, and the church are co-heirs with Israel through faith in Jesus Christ, but the promises were never made to them. It was made to this people, and therefore they are grafted in by faith. They were estranged from God with no priesthood, no covenants, nothing, separated from God, and they become heirs through faith of promises made to these people. So 5 of the 8 covenants were made to Israel. I think it's very important to understand. The others were made to mankind generally, and I think that's important. Only one of the 5 covenants made, only one of the 5 made with Israel are conditional, meaning bilateral. And which one would that be? We know it will be the covenant made with Moses and through Moses with the people Israel. That's the Mosaic covenant. The other 4 covenants with Israel are unconditional, and we'll see that. That's with Abraham, the land and Davidic covenant, and the new covenant. They're all unconditional. And I think it's also critically important to understand why God gave these covenants and what is His plan in the process of salvation. And what we'll see unfold during the course of these studies is in actual fact the story of salvation. The story of salvation of, number 1, a specific people, and then number 2, other believers from other nations, and how God is going to bring that about. I just want to help you with something. If you understand the covenants, when you get to a difficult book, or supposedly difficult, like Romans chapter 8, chapter 9 and 10, all of a sudden your eyes will be opened with reference to election. Because what we'll see when we link that to the covenants is that God chose for Himself a people through whom He will bring about a divinely planned salvation. He elected a people through whom He would bring about salvation by grace through faith. Okay. And we'll see that highlighted in the covenant. So keep this in the back of your mind, because we are going to look at Romans chapter 9 and the falsities of predestination later. Now, 4 things should be noted. Number 1, there are literal covenants. Literal covenants. Now, I think this is important, especially in the light of world politics today. We are talking about 5 covenants made with Israel, literal covenants. Like we know, there's a certain group of people who would love to change the focus of these covenants to say, well, it was not through Isaac, but through Ishmael. Right? A twist. It wasn't done with, and wasn't confirmed Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. It was confirmed with Ishmael. And so they are literal covenants made with literal people. I think one of the most important, the covenants that God has made with Israel are eternal. And when we read the scriptures, to our astonishment, we will discover that they are indeed eternal, and everything that He made in that covenant will be established. You'll see a bit later what I mention here is very important. Covenants are very interesting. Some of them come to pass immediately. Some of them a few years later, and some of them are waiting for the millennial reign of the Messiah when Shiloh comes, or that Prince of Peace. Right? So God made these promises, and He will certainly bring them about. And I think that's one of the things we currently see in the Middle East. There is, for example, a land covenant and a restoration of a people, a remnant which God has chosen for Himself. And there's this massive dispute. But the Bible tells us that irrespective of what the world says, or the United Nations, or any one of these carnal men who do not accept the Bible as truth, and who do not take these covenants as literal, irrespective of them, the Messiah will come, and He will confirm everything that He has promised through these covenants from the beginning. He will be their head. He will rule and reign from Jerusalem. He will establish the borders again. He will have His kingdom and His priesthood. And that's what we will see. The faithfulness of God through these covenants, because they are eternal, although we do not see fulfillment now. So keep in the back of your mind, it's not necessarily always immediate, but it will come. That's why, for example, a dispensation, for the lack of a better word, of that specific covenant, that dispensation might come to an end and another covenant follows, but some of those promises made in those unconditional covenants were not seen yet and will be fulfilled, because God is not a man that He should lie. Numbers 23:19. He will establish everything. And remember what we have seen in prophetic words. Everything is fulfilled exactly. And so, when it comes to covenants, everything will be fulfilled exactly. If He kept His word as far as the prophecies are concerned, rest assured He will keep His word as far as the covenants are concerned, because He is what He is. Right? Now, number 3. These are unconditional covenants that were not abrogated because of Israel's disobedience, some of them, right? So there's 1 conditional, 4 unconditional. They never stopped because Israel was disobedient. There were consequences for their disobedience, but it doesn't mean that the unconditional covenants were cancelled. They suffered the consequences of disobeying and breaking that conditional covenant, but the rest is still very much fully intact. I'm just thinking of people who believes in a skewed Israelology and replacement theology with the whole concept of God divorced His people. It's just because they're quoting text out of context and don't understand what they read. There's this whole British Israel and New Israel movement that is completely off the track because of this. 4th, these covenants were made with a specific people. They're not generalized. They're literal, they're specific, they're eternal, and the unconditional covenants will definitely be confirmed and established. Those are important things. Listen, think for one single moment. Where do we derive our benefit? We derive our benefit from the renewed covenant, right? which was made to the Jew, and we co-inherit by faith what was promised to them. Right? If God, for one single moment, would break one of these promises that He made to them, what hope do you think we'll have? Then our faith is in vain. But because it's the same God who makes the same promises on the basis of His own character alone, we have confidence. Because we see Him fulfill His promises to Israel in the present, we know He will fulfill His promises towards the church. Come on, that's fantastically encouraging. So, let's begin. When we say that these covenants were made to a specific people, we need to go look at the word and see what it says. In Romans 9 verse 4, for they are Israelites, and to them belong God's adoption as a nation, and the glorious presence or the Shekinah. With them were the special covenants. Do you see that? Multiple. 5 of them made. To them was the law given, which was formed part of the one conditional covenant. To them, the temple worship was revealed and God's own promises announced. So they received the prophetic word, they received the covenants, and they received the conditions of the conditional covenant. Do you see Gentile anywhere? What is so interesting to me is that you have a Gentile church that generally despise and hate the Jew, but they are grafted into the Jewish promises and serving a Jewish God, a Jewish Messiah. That's always astonishing. But they want it all. Anyway, so, I'm sorry, for me, as a believer, at the end of the age, looking at eschatology and the fulfillment of these covenant promises gives me hope. It's wonderful to see. There's such strength of faith in it. Ephesians 2:11, therefore remember that at one time you were Gentile heathens in the flesh, called uncircumcision. Now, circumcision is a sign of a conditional covenant made through Moses with the people. The Mosaic covenant. Now he calls the Gentiles uncircumcision. In other words, directly by implication, you had no agreement with God. You had nothing to do with God. As a matter of fact, you were running around in the wild with your little skins on and doing vile things, right? By those who called themselves circumcision, remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, utterly estranged and outlawed from the rights of Israel as a nation, strangers with no share in the sacred compacts. What are those? Covenants of the messianic promise, with no knowledge of or right in God's agreement and His covenants. You had no knowledge of covenants. You were clueless, because these covenants were not made to you. Now, we are going to see, very interestingly, 3 covenants that initially covers all of man. Right? So don't get too much discouraged. We'll see through the covenants made to Israel, it had everything to do with the plan of redemption. Okay? But we'll see that God had all of us in mind from the beginning to save through faith in the promised Messiah. He just had to come through a specific people, right? Now, as I mentioned earlier, 5 of the Bible covenants belong to the people Israel. Now, previously I mentioned the covenant doesn't, with all its provisions, may or may not go into immediate effect. Some go right away, some in the near future, and some in the distant prophetic future. Looking forward to the completion of everything. I think some of these covenants, they are so significant and prophetic of that which is to come. Specific simply pointing to a messianic age. And this is how we know, if we understand this, how we know to correctly interpret the Bible. Remember, Jacob taught us so well that in the Jewish mind, prophecies are repetitive fulfillments, every time pointing to an ultimate fulfillment at the end. Every time it's a type of that which is to finally come. Right? And so with that in view, and with the covenants in view, we see that they run parallel towards a final fulfillment of a messianic age, where some of these things in the covenants are not yet seen. The land is not yet restored to its full measure and all the boundaries. We see them trying really hard. We see them trying to establish it by the flesh at first. Christ is not yet recognized amongst his people as the Messiah that came. He's not yet ruling and reigning from his father's throne, King David. And we'll see these things fulfilled. So in other words, the covenants and the prophecies pointing to a final fulfillment in the Messianic age. Again, if you understand that, what is it pointing to? Salvation and the rule and reign of Christ. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Now, we start off this evening with the Eden covenant, or the Edenic covenant, that which was made to Adam at the beginning. Now in Genesis 1:28 to 30, God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful, it's never been a problem, and multiply, absolutely, doing that and counting, and replenish the earth. It's one part they are keeping, right? And subdue it and have dominion. Some abuse that. Over the fish of the sea, the birds of the heaven, and every living thing. So we see the next point in Genesis 2:15 and to 17. Jehovah God took the man, put him in the Garden of Eden, and to dress and keep it. He wasn't there to sit around idly. He was to do something. Dress and keep it. Jehovah God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it, for in the day that you eat thereof you shall surely die. Is that conditional or unconditional? We see that's the first covenant, and it's got one condition. Don't eat, because if you eat you'll die. Just one condition. How difficult can that be? Clearly too difficult for man. What's the problem? Adam is representative of the whole human race that would follow out of him, right? Therefore, when we see this, it includes all of his posterity, not yet born. So in this context, when God's going to make a covenant with this man, it's going to include all of mankind. Clear? All of mankind. We see in Hosea 6 verse 7 the reference to the fact that this is the Edenic covenant, where he says, but they like Adam have transgressed the covenant. Where does it ever say God made a covenant with Adam? Well, right there. What is he referring to? That one condition he gave to him so that he can live. Okay, now watch. The covenant was made between God and Adam, in which Adam stood as the representative or the head of the human race. We know when we look at the covenants, God makes it with the head of a nation, or a nation that would still be born. And then they are all included. Then he will confirm it to the following generations. He will confirm that covenant because that was what he had in mind to begin with. So here we are dealing with Adam as the head of the human race. So, number one. First, there is an instruction to be fruitful, to multiply, replenish the earth. Next thing that we see, man was instructed to subdue the earth. Third thing, to have dominion over all living things. Fourth thing, there was a provision concerning man's diet. What we'll see is how it changes He'll be, what do you call it? Herbivore, right? He'll eat green stuff. That's it. And now lots of people in the modern day make a big issue about it. It was just eat greens. They made it a dietary law. But to Adam it was told, why? Nothing should be killed. No blood. No death. You eat the green, the plants that is given for food. Right? So there's a dietary provision. Number 5, he was to dress and to keep the garden. He was not to sit around idly and just enjoy the fruits of the trees. He was supposed to do something, and I'm very sure because he walked with God, he knew what to do. Number 6. Now comes the one condition. He was forbidden to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that was definitely given to test man's obedience. He had a free will. He was a free moral agent. He was made positionally holy, but now he had to be confirmed in that holy state by exercising his free will to choose against the one and for the other. Because that would be the precondition for true love for God. True service towards Him. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. He's got a free will. He chooses God. He expresses that free will. So he was put to the test. We know the rest of the story, right? Number 7. The provision contained a penalty for disobedience, which is spiritual death to be followed by a physical death. We know this cannot just refer to physical death because man did not die on the very day that he disobeyed the commandments. So the breaking of this commandment would separate Adam and all generations following him from God. They would be born into something of a separated spiritual state, dead to God and alive to themselves. Now, let's go further. This was obviously known as the dispensation of innocence. We know that man is not yet in a fallen state. Ignorance is bliss, I guess. And they were skipping between the daisies there. Until one morning, Satan appeared in the Garden of Eden as a fallen creature. What does that point out? That's it. It's so important. Sin was already in existence. I'm not going to elaborate on this, but I sort of agree with Fruchtenbaum on his studies of Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14. That cherub that fell, the anointed cherub that fell, where he had his previous authority and it was now taken away from him. And here we have Adam and Eve in the garden and he appears. In other words, that fall was before the temptation and he came in that same guise as one who turned away from God and towards himself to tempt man with the same principle. Right? And we see something amazing. In Genesis 3:6 it said, and the woman saw that the tree was good for food. And we go to 1 John 2:16, it talks about the lust of the flesh. It was good for food. It was delightful to look at, the lust of the eyes. And it was desired to make one wise, the pride of life. The 3 areas. Ever wondered about that cartoon with the devil and a 3-pronged fork? It speaks about, ironically, the 3 things by which men are tempted. Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. She took of the fruit and she gave some also to her husband and he ate. Now what is significant here, they transgress that one condition of this covenant, and obviously everything they were instructed to do is going to suffer as a consequence. And God is going to establish this Edenic covenant with them, the promise that is still to follow. Right, so here is something important. Adam knew what he was doing. The woman was deceived. Now keep this in the back of your mind. He associated himself with the sin of his wife. Because he would point us later to the last Adam, who would associate himself with the sin of his people to redeem them. He knew what he was doing. He wasn't deceived. He yet chose to become one with her in the same manner that Christ will choose to take sin upon himself, not become a sinner, but to take the sins of his people upon himself and associate himself with them that he might redeem them. Okay? So already in that, there is a hint of what would come. Right? And here it comes. Genesis 3:14 to 19. And Jehovah God said unto the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all cattle and above every beast of the field. Upon your belly shall you go, and dust shall you eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now, that in the traditional church is referred to as the mother promise. Have you ever heard that? Probably the mother of all promises. But that's the first promise of the Messiah that would come, who would be struck by the serpent, but the seed of the woman, the Messiah, would crush his head fully and finally. Now let's look at this. Who are participating in this? It's between God and Adam. And we're going to see how each one of these parties in this covenant is involved and how they participate. So, number one, Adam again represents the whole human race. And let's see. To the serpent, he says, you'll be cursed above all other creatures. To the serpent, he also says that he will crawl on his belly. We assume, therefore, that he did not crawl on his belly before this. Right? And then third thing, he says to the serpent, dust shall be the serpent's food. Now, then science kicks in and says, snakes don't eat dust, do they? Well, no, they don't, because go read then Micah 7:17 and other passages in the Old Testament. We'll see that it's a Hebrew idiom meaning to be especially cursed. That's the lowest of the low. You shall eat dust. It's a curse. You'll be the lowest of the low. And indeed, when Christ returns to destroy the seed of the serpent, who would be the most despised of all creatures? Satan himself. You'll be cursed above everyone else. You'll be the lowest of the low. As the one who raised yourself up to be the highest, you will be the lowest of the low. So in this, there is already a promise. There will come a day when he will be extremely, excessively cursed above everything else and brought low. There's already a promise of victory in that. Isn't that fantastic? Now, what is interesting, and what I found very interesting, was this. The provisions are given in relationship to Satan. Man, this is significant. Watch. Number one, there would be perpetual hatred between Satan and the woman. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. You know what is so significant? What we see in the book of Revelations is the rise of two women, the bride and the whore. But significantly, two women. And we see the figure of woman very prominently throughout Scripture. And we see the hatred of Satan against women. And we see it even now in the last days before the return of the Messiah, how he stirs them up in revolt through feminism in a process to actually destroy everything they were created for. But they're too blind to see it. He's at enmity with this woman. You know why? Because the Lord also made a promise that through her, the promised Messiah would come into the earth. And since then, he hated the woman and sought to destroy her. Very significant. Second, the hatred will culminate between Satan's seed, the Antichrist, and the woman's seed, the Messiah. Third, the serpent would bruise the heel of the woman's seed, and we know that it happened at the crucifixion, where he was struck down. And the fourth thing, the most important in this, is that the woman's seed will crush Satan's head. I think the most important here, and that's why I highlighted in red, is that the main point of the prophecy is that the Messiah would be the seed of the woman. And we follow this seed throughout the Old Testament. Later we're going to see that the seed of the woman is coming through Abraham and Abraham's seed, singular capital letter, through David, through the covenants, until the Messiah is actually born. Right. Here is the significant portion of Scripture in Isaiah 7:14, where first we understand that the Messiah will be conceived and born of a virgin. And all of a sudden the two make clear sense. We see Isaiah 7:14 and Genesis 3:15 connect. And we know that through the woman specifically, there will be the birth of the divine child and the Savior. So, as far as the woman is concerned, number one, multiplication of menstrual pain and conception. Now, why they say that is if you go and look at the Greek language, it's referring to exactly that. So this whole reproductive system becomes one filled with pain and joy. That's where it comes from. Number two, she will give birth in pain. However, after birth there will be joy. And number three, a very interesting one, the wife was to be in subjection to the husband. Literally, again, very interesting. The Bible says your desire shall be after your husband, but he will rule it over you. Now, if you read that in English, it sounds very odd. It means poor wife, she just wants to be with her husband, he just wants to be the boss all the time. Right? Isn't that what it means when you read it literally in English? What it really says is this. Because of this fall and a separation, and because the woman was easily deceived, what will happen now? It will perpetuate itself. Her desire will be to rule over her husband, but he will rule it over her. It will be for her protection, and she will find peace if she submits to that. Okay? Now, as far as the man is concerned, we find this in Genesis 3, verse 17 to 19. Okay? Number one, the judgment of Adam will become the judgment of the whole human race. Number two, the earth was cursed. It brought forth thorns, thistles, and weeds. We can assume man was given the responsibility to care for and tend the garden. But now all of a sudden it's going to be with opposition from nature itself. All of a sudden he will work and gain by the sweat of his brow. Labor will become difficult and hard. Okay. Again, we see something as far as diet is concerned. It continues to be vegetarian as it was under the Edenic covenant at first. Man's work was to be characterized by hard labor. And here we have it, physical death is introduced. We see, for example, in Romans 5:12, sin came into the world through one man, and through that death as a result of sin, and so death spread to all men. So God kept his word. He said, in the day you eat of it, you'll die. But look at the grace of God. Please look at it. He said to them, in the day you eat of it, you'll die. And yet, after that, he already had his plan of salvation in place. And he promised salvation through the seed of the woman. Is that conditional or unconditional? It's unconditional. He will do it. How do we know? What do we see? Well, two things we see. Once he drove them out of the garden, we see him cover the man and his wife with the skin of an animal. They were naked, remember? Who killed the animal? We can only conclude that God did it. Where did he get the skin? He had to take the life of an animal, take that skin and cover them, which is a type of God that will reconcile himself with man. He will take the initiative. He will do the work, pointing to exactly this promise that he made through the seed of the woman. Further, we see in the sacrifice of Cain and Abel, he rejected Cain's offering, which was by the sweat of his brow, but he accepted Abel's sacrifice, which was by faith in the blood of an animal. You understand? Both of them confirming and pointing to the same promise, that he will reconcile us with himself through the seed of the woman. Does that include all men? You better believe it. It includes all of us. So, God made a covenant. There was a condition. There were certain privileges. Man broke that. Adam, as the head of the human race, was cast out of the garden. But in spite of that, there was a promise that this serpent would ultimately be defeated and crushed under the seed of the woman. We have seen a partial fulfillment, but he is still an enemy. So is this thing completely fulfilled? No. It's a perpetual covenant. We'll see it completely fulfilled when Christ returns and Satan is finally cast into the lake of fire. It will happen because he made a covenant. He will be the most cursed, the lowest of the low, and brought to nothing. Okay? Then, what do we see? Man, Adam, is driven out, a representative of all mankind, but God will make a way through his way of salvation. There's the gospel for you in the Edenic covenant. You see that? Hope for all mankind. Keep this in the back of your minds as we progress through the covenants. Hope for all mankind. Let's just start with the Noahic covenant. What on earth is the Noahic covenant? Well, in Genesis 9, verse 1 to 17, we find it. God blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Whew. Now, let me explain. We're missing part of the story. Genesis 6, we have the big flood. God chose 8 people. Noah and his sons and their wives and Noah's wife. And they all went into the ark. Right? Now he made a covenant to Adam. And he's going to repeat some of those promises and conditions to Noah. Because now all the earth would further be repopulated through Noah. First, the earth was to be populated through Adam, but we know most of Adam's seed was destroyed because it was about 2,000 years. They had plenty time to replenish the earth, and most of that seed was destroyed. And then we know God chose the 8, and now through them he will have to repeat what he said to Adam. Be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth. You see, he said that to Adam as well. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of heaven, with all wherewith the ground teems and all the fishes of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. In other words, again, rule over them. Every moving thing that lives shall be your food for you. Now they can eat everything. As the green herbs have I given you all, but flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall you not eat. Okay, I'm sorry, that's not yet changed, right? And surely your blood, the blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast will I require it. So life for life, right? And at the hand of man, somebody kills you, one man kills another, he'll die. Even at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man, and you be fruitful and multiply. Bring forth abundantly in the earth and multiply therein. And God spoke unto Noah and to his sons with him, saying, And I, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, every beast of the earth with you, and all that go out of the ark, even every beast of the earth. And I will establish my covenant with you. Neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by water of the flood, neither shall there any more be flood to destroy the earth. And then, of course, we see it is a perpetual, for perpetual generations. It's a perpetual covenant, an ongoing covenant, or it's known as the everlasting covenant. Super important, this one. Super important. It's still in place. We know He will never destroy the world through water again, but He will through fire. It shall come to pass when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of flesh, and the waters shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. This is a token of the covenant. See how many times they repeat the word covenant, 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 which I have established between me and all flesh of the earth. So that includes all men. Okay, this covenant was made between God and Noah. Like Adam, Noah stood for a representative of the entire human race. Let's take our break and then we go into the provisions of this covenant. Okay? Let's continue with the next portion and the Noahic covenant. And again, what we see, the Noahic covenant, or Noah stood as a representative for the entire human race. I want to just help you and remind you to keep in the back of your mind the whole story of redemption. That's what we see through these covenants. God relates to man through covenants. And we see that from the beginning, first with Adam, now with Noah. And what is the hope that you and I can derive out of these covenants? Let's look at first the provisions of the covenant. Number one. Again, man was to repopulate the earth. This is after the flood. Now, everybody that sits here with confidence can say, you are from the line of Noah and his sons somewhere. Right? What is important? The command to subdue the earth here. Not repeated. Okay, but they are to rule and reign and repopulate. Number two, the fear of man was put into animals and man was to dominate them. Imagine, after this, everything's going to run away. And when you see these animals run away with fear for man, even today, you know where it comes from. Right? The next point, number three, man's diet was to consist both of everything, every moving thing and the green herbs. Right? All animals were fit for food. They were not supposed to have blood in them. Man could not eat anything with blood in it, but now he could eat animals. So the diet changed. Fourth, man was forbidden to eat blood. Why? Because this has significance when it comes to the life of the soul is in the blood, and sacrifice by the blood of the Lamb. Number five, capital punishment became a part of the human economy for the first time. Life for life. An animal kills a man, the animal will die. A man kills a man, the man will die. All murderers were to be executed. This is under the Noahic covenant. Next point. Humanity would never again be destroyed by a worldwide flood. Never be destroyed by a worldwide flood, but humanity will again be destroyed after a remnant is taken out. Number 7, the token of the covenant was the rainbow. Now, I think what is important about the Noahic covenant are these points that I've highlighted. It became the basis for the dispensation of human government. Human government. Right? Although this dispensation has been superseded, the unconditional Noahic covenant is still very much in effect. What is important, and this is significant, the judgments of the tribulation against the Gentiles will come because of violation of the Noahic covenant. All those things are still applicable to man, and the violation of it will later bring judgment. Okay? Again, according to Isaiah 24:5-6, the judgments come because humanity has violated the everlasting covenant. And you can do yourself a favor and go read it. We see here it's called the everlasting covenant in Genesis 9:16. Let me read it. When the bow or the rainbow is in the clouds and I look upon it, I will earnestly remember the everlasting covenant or pledge between God and every living creature. It's a token or a sign establishing between me and all flesh upon the earth. It's an everlasting. So the in Noahic covenant is called the everlasting covenant, and according to Isaiah 24:5-6, judgments will come because humanity broke the everlasting covenant, referring to this specifically. Am I clear? Now, let's go further. The third covenant that we'll do tonight, which now starts quite a substantial covenant, is that made with Abraham. So, let's look. First, with in the book of Genesis with Adam, the Adamic covenant, God makes a promise that He will save man through the seed of the woman. And we see after that promise the two types very clearly. That it will be from God's side, it will be His initiative, and man will receive the righteousness as provided by God that will again cover him. That covenant is in place. It came into fulfillment when Christ came. Okay? In Isaiah 53, the Bible tells us it pleased God to crush His Son, or to crush Him for our sakes. In other words, that animal was slain as a type of the lamb that would be slain in the form of our Messiah. It's still in place and fulfilled at the coming of Messiah. So, nothing that happened afterwards canceled that promise of salvation through the Messiah. Then comes the Noahic covenant, where God will save through His Son. Is still intact, but now what happens is God says, I will not destroy the earth again through water. I again give man the instruction to fill the earth, to rule and reign here, right? And again, He gives a sign of that covenant that He will not destroy the earth through water. Now comes the third covenant, which is the Abrahamic covenant, and we see how what He initially promised is going to come into fulfillment through the Abrahamic covenant. Where do we find this? In Genesis 12 from verse 1 to 3. Now Jehovah said unto Abram, Get you out of your country and from your kindred and from your father's house unto the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and be you a blessing, and I will bless them that bless you, and him that curses you will I curse, and in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Now, would that include the Gentiles? Well, it says all the families of the earth. So let's look at it quickly. We're going to see how there are two paths that develop out of this covenant with Abraham. There is a spiritual and a physical implication to these covenants. There is a specific application to all the nations, both Jew and Gentile, and there is a specific application to the Jews exclusively. Was Abraham a Jew? Abraham was both Jew and Gentile. He was first a Gentile and then a Jew. That's why he stands for both. Did you get that? He was uncircumcised, a Gentile of the Gentiles. God chose him, makes a covenant with him, and he becomes the circumcised. So he represents on one side the Gentiles, and on the other side the Jews. That's why we see a two-sided application to the covenants made with Abraham, right? The one applicable to all the nations, and the other one to the Jews specifically. Now, Genesis 12:7, and Jehovah appeared unto Abram and said, Unto your seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto Jehovah who appeared unto him. You'll see this will later fully develop into what is known as the land covenant to a specific people. Okay? Genesis 13 verse 14 to 17. And Jehovah said unto Abraham, after that Lot was separated from him, lift up now your eyes and look from the place where you are, northwards and southwards and eastward and westward, for all the land which you see, to you will I give it, and to your seed forever. This is a very interesting scripture. Abram's seed. Now he's referring to a specific people. And again you'll see a huge effort by certain of the seed of Abraham, which is not the promised seed, who claims that, but they are the seed and they want the land. So it's interesting that one of the main characteristics of the covenant made to Abraham started with land. A physical place. Why? Because we see later from Abraham will come the seed, singular, capital letter, who will rule from this specific place as promised. Okay? Again, it centers around first the Messiah and then the people through whom the Messiah would come. Okay? For all the land which you see, to you will I give it, and to your seed forever. And I will make your seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then your seed also be numbered. Also, walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it, for unto you will I give it. Isn't it interesting? He repeats twice the promise of the land, and then he says, I will make you a great nation, and your seed will be many. Now, first we see the seed referred to as dust. In other words, innumerable. And then we'll see now how the seed is separated. Sand of the sea, stars of heaven. All of a sudden, Jew and Gentile. Okay? Genesis 15 verse 1 to 21. We're not going to go through it. Chapter 17, 1:21. Again, there are certain things highlighted which I just want to mention. First of all, Abram would be the father of one nation in particular, in the natural, but he will also be the father of a spiritual people, those who have the faith of Abraham. Second, he would father many nations in general. Now, how do we find that? Again, it's something physical, because he had a son through Hagar, which is Ishmael. And we know that Sarah, through whom the promised son was born, asked Abraham, take this bondwoman and her son away from me. And the Lord had pity and mercy on Ishmael, because he was also a son of Abraham, although be it that he was illegitimate. It wasn't according to the will and plan of God, but God still honored him because he was Abraham's son, and he also became a nation. As a matter of fact, the angel said something very particular about him. You know, he's a man of war. He's an obstinate man. He's a cantankerous man. Just making trouble wherever he goes. And voila, thanks, Abraham. You know. Anyway, who am I to speak? But there we see the result of this man's self-effort. So he would be the father of one nation in particular and father of many nations in general. This is not referring to spiritual but physical seed. Third, there would be a sign and a seal of the Abrahamic covenant. It is first thing, and spells out the exact borders of the Abrahamic covenant as extending from the river of Egypt in the south to the great river Euphrates in the north. So now in this portion of scripture he even goes into the full description. It's a massive piece of land, right? The emphasis of Genesis 17 is on the token of the covenant, physical circumcision on the 8th day of a boy's life. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Middle Eastern people all practiced a type of circumcision. What made the Jewish circumcision so significant was circumcision on the 8th day, right? And that is something to keep in the back of your mind. Just as the rainbow was a token of the Noahic covenant, the circumcision is the token of the Abrahamic covenant. Now let's see. When we go to the book of Romans chapter 4, what do we find there? Abraham received the sign of circumcision after he believed. He was not circumcised and therefore was counted worthy and believed. He first believed and then was circumcised. In the same manner, the children of Abraham from the Gentile side will believe and then be circumcised where? In the heart. The flesh will be cut away. They'll be separated from the world. They'll be a peculiar people. So, again, there is an application physically and spiritually. Spiritually, we believe and are circumcised and set aside as a peculiar people because we believe like Abraham believed. And what did Abraham believe? Oh, he believed God. No. He believed God that through him the promised seed would come. He was looking forward to that promised seed and was counted to him as righteousness. Right? In the same manner, we look back at the same seed and believe in him that was promised and we count it as righteous from faith to faith. It's the same principle. Those who believe like Abraham are circumcised and made part and parcel of this promise. Galatians 3. We are co-heirs with Abraham. All those who are baptized into Christ have clothed themselves with Christ and are co-heirs with Abraham. All of a sudden there's an application to the spiritual side of the covenant for all men. What do I see? I see that God makes a promise to Adam. That promise must come in fulfillment. He chooses a specific man. And now what we're going to see, through that man will come a nation. And through that nation will come the seed, through whom both Jew and Gentile will be saved. The covenants are the story of salvation, both for Jew and for Gentile, but in very particular terms, also something that will happen to the Jewish nation. God will fulfill all these promises he has made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He will fulfill it. Because for the first time, when he sets aside a man who would be the head of a family, the father of the Jewish nation, we see that he makes some very particular promises about a people, about a land, and the peculiar identity of those people as a circumcised people set apart for God. Take note. The moment Abraham entered into a covenant with God, he was peculiar, set aside, circumcised, separated from the world for God's purposes. It works that way physically because Israel was called to be a priesthood unto the nations, like their father Abraham, and the believer is also called to be a royal priesthood, 1 Peter 2 verse 2. Do you see the parallels? Right, let's go further. Genesis 22 verse 15. And the angel of Jehovah called unto Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, By myself have I sworn, says Jehovah. Again, when we did the doctrine of the Trinity or the Triunity. You see here the angel of the Lord calls himself Jehovah, and we know who we're dealing with. It's a Christophany. He said to him, by myself have I sworn, said Jehovah, because you have done this thing, and I have not withheld your son, your only son, that in blessing I will bless you, and in multiplying I will multiply your seed as the stars of heaven, as the sand which is upon the seashore. Now we have suddenly a division, and few people understand what that is. It's generally accepted that the stars of heaven are referring to the Jewish nation. Sands of the sea, the Gentiles. Now we see there's an indication, if we interpret this correctly, of a physical and a spiritual heritage made for this man. Now watch carefully. And your seed shall possess the gates of his enemies. What is he talking about now? And watch, and in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Now he's talking about Christ. You see, to Adam he made a promise. He said, the seed of the woman shall crush the serpent's head. Now he says to Abraham, your seed shall possess the gates of his. It's singular, referring to one single person, not plural, they, meaning Israel. His. And your seed, in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Clearly referring to one single seed by whom the nations will be saved. Christ. Isn't that beautiful? Now, let's see the participants. Abraham stood as the representative or head of the whole Jewish nation, and not for all humanity when it comes to specifics. We're talking about land, we're talking about the circumcision and a set-apart nation, okay? But we know that all who believed would be grafted into this very specific covenant made. Now watch. The provisions of the covenant. First, he'll be a great nation, and that nation will be Israel. Let's be clear. The great nation would not be through Ishmael, but through Isaac. Okay, second, they will have a very specific promise for land, specifically the land of Canaan. There are so many scriptures referring to that. They are in brackets there that you can look at when we release the video. Third, Abraham himself was to be greatly blessed. He will be as a man blessed. And we know it was surely so when we look at how he worked his uncle's business. Fourth, Abraham's name would be great. Abraham will be a blessing to others. Or rather, I should write there, through Abraham's seed, it will be a blessing to others. Those who bless Israel will be blessed. Those who curse Israel will be cursed. Why do we say Israel? Because we don't see Israel there. You see, again, it's a covenant made to the head of a family, meaning him and his whole posterity. And we later see this repeated and much more clarity towards the people Israel specifically. Number 8. In Abraham's seed, all will ultimately be blessed. Abraham's seed. Okay? Do keep in the back of your mind, how will it work going forward? So God chooses a man. Through that man, he confirms this covenant to this man's son and his grandson. And through the grandson, 12 sons are born and a nation is established. And he confirms to the nation what he promised to their fathers. Right? And through that nation will come the promised seed. And now think about it. When this nation sojourned through the wilderness, and when they had Gentiles who joined them, guess what happened? If the Gentiles were willing to be circumcised and submit to the conditions of the covenant, they could walk with them. What was that a type of? It was a type of what would come later. The covenant was made to these people, specifically, but it would include all those who would be willing to believe and who would be circumcised by heart and join a selected people. Do you understand? Take note to whom the covenant was made. Yes, we say that Abraham was the father of both Jew and Gentile because he was uncircumcised and later circumcised. But what that means there's a benefit for us if we believe the same way he believes. Then we'll see the fulfillment of the covenant through a specific people. And when we look at the conditions of the covenants that would follow, they would all point to Christ. Meaning he makes a covenant now with Moses. But the core of that covenant centers around the Levitical priesthood and the sacrifices pointing to Christ. Everything from beginning to end is about the salvation which is in Christ Jesus. First to the Jew and then to the Gentile. But God always had all mankind in view. Do you understand that? You are not excluded. That's the important thing. So what if they are first? It's God's sovereign choice. What's your problem? Just deal with it, Just deal with it. Now watch. Abraham will receive a son through his wife Sarah. Not his, what do you call that? The bondwoman, which is not his legitimate wife, Hagar. Okay. The next point, his descendants would undergo the Egyptian bondage. This is very interesting. How do we know we're dealing with the right people? Well, no Islamic nation was ever in bondage and slavery under the Egyptians. Oops. He said that's what would happen. It'd be a characteristic of this specific nation. Let's look at this quickly. You have this land covenant made to Abraham and his descendants, and we see that covenant is not yet fulfilled. They don't have it yet. They don't have the full boundaries of it. Oh, they had something for a while, then it got taken away. But what does it mean? It means the day will come when they will have it, whether the UN likes it or not, or whether the guys from the desert next door likes it or not, it's going to happen. It's just what it is. Go sort it out with God if you can. Next point. Other nations as well as Israel would come forth from Abraham, and we know why that happened. He put it in the rough there with Hagar, and of course that son also became a nation and other kings. Number 12. His name was to be changed from Abraham, meaning exalted father, to Abram to Abraham, meaning father of a multitude. How beautiful is that? Father of a multitude. Even in the change of his name, we see something significant. We know that the Lord inserted his name into Abram's name with the Jehovah AH. He puts it into this man's name, meaning he's in covenant with God. But all of a sudden the meaning of that name changes because the Lord God Jehovah is also the Savior of man. And through this man will come salvation. Okay? Or through his seed rather. Let's clarify that. Sarai's name, meaning my princess, was to be changed to Sarah, meaning the princess. Okay. 14, circumcision was to be the token of the covenant. Okay, now wait a minute. Let us now get something very clear. He's the father of a physical nation. And one thing that very few people understand is that we will see later when we study the Mosaic covenant, there are two signs by which we will know these are the physical descendants of Abraham and the peculiar people. Which are they? Circumcision and the Sabbath. As a signs of this particular covenant which God would make with a particular people. Just think about that. I'm not running ahead with myself regarding the Sabbath and these modern day Hebrew roots deceivers. Now, Circumcision, which is important, would show this to be a blood covenant and emphasizes its solemnity. This is serious stuff. Once blood flows, we're in business. It's binding. Now let's look further to the provisions of the covenant. Now first, we want to see how it addresses Abraham. Abraham was to be the father of a great nation, which was Israel. We see that, a physical nation. And he was to possess all of the promised land, not a city cut in half or a skimpy portion given, but all of it. Not just the part that the British thought they could give or that they thought were the boundaries, but the whole enchilada will come their way. To the seed, Israel, the nation of Israel was to become great. Well, and I think that greatness is very much related to them taking up the spiritual priesthood they were initially called to fulfill. Okay? The fact that the promise was made to both Abraham and his seed shows that these blessings have not yet received complete fulfillment, but await what? The Messianic kingdom. And there we go again. There are certain things that we've already seen in the other two covenants that are not yet fulfilled. What is it waiting for? The beautiful portion of Scripture that we see in the New Testament is this, is that Christ is the fulfillment, the end of the law, or the pinnacle, the actual fulfillment of everything that was promised. And so we will see Him also fulfilling these covenant promises that are not yet fulfilled. Because God is not a man that He should lie. He will keep His word. He will fulfill these covenant promises, but in and through the Messiah and the Messiah alone. Now let's look quickly to the Gentiles. To the Gentiles, they would be blessed for blessing Israel, cursed for cursing Israel. They were to receive spiritual blessing. How? Through the seed that would come, and that one specific seed of Abraham, which is the Messiah. I think we are very familiar with that. But let's go and have a look at some scriptures. So we can reduce this covenant to three main components: the land, the seed, or the capital letter seed aspect, which is the Messiah, and the blessings, the restoration of this nation. Please, guys, I know this is a lot of Bible study, but these are important aspects that we need to consider. And just think for yourself, have we seen these things fulfilled? Are they going to be fulfilled? And if we see that they are not fulfilled, and we see that in the process of being fulfilled, we can start to interpret eschatology more accurately. Okay? Now, the reason why I say that is because many people believe that these things have been fulfilled completely, and some people believe we're actually living in the millennium right now, and I don't know where they get these things. The confirmation of the covenants. Number one, God made the covenant to Abraham, and now He confirms it to Abraham's son, Isaac. Abraham had 8 sons by 3 different women. Okay? The question is, who was the son, the legitimate son? Who was the legitimate son? Well, I just showed you now. We know particularly who the nation would be, but the legitimate son, God would Himself confirm, isn't it? He would Himself confirm. In Genesis 26 verse 2, and the Lord appeared to him. Who is that? Isaac. Isaac, not Ishmael. Isaac. Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land of which I will tell you. Dwell temporarily in the land, and I will be with you and will favor you with blessings. Now verse 4, I will make your descendants to multiply as the stars of the heavens. Exactly the same He said to his father. He keeps His word. Okay? And will give to you posterity all these lands. Now He's again confirming the land agreement as part of the covenant. And by your offspring. Now His offspring, capital letter, and seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Or by him bless themselves. Now watch. Offspring, capital letter, seed, capital letter, all the nations. What is that referring to? The Lord said to Abram, through your seed, singular, capital letter, referring to Christ. Now, he's talking to Isaac. Let's just think quickly. What is the significant thing that happened with Abram and Isaac? The Lord gave him this son when Abraham was beyond his years, and his wife also beyond years to conceive. By faith alone, through grace alone, God gave him the son of promise who he would require to be sacrificed. Don't you think that's significant? There would be another son that would come who would be sacrificed, who would be the son of promise in whom we will believe. And then we see something significant. Abram, through faith, believed that God could even raise the son from the dead. And he went in obedience and was willing to sacrifice that son. Now we know God's not into human sacrifice. He wouldn't take this son. And he stopped him before he could kill him. But it's significant because again, in this very fulfillment of the son of promise given by faith, we see a pointer to Christ himself. One of the most significant pointers to Christ in the Old Testament. Okay? So, now we see the Lord confirming this covenant to Isaac. And again he says to Isaac, listen, through you will the seed come. The same that he said to Abram. And Isaac was the son of promise, born of faith. What is interesting about Abram, Isaac, and Jacob and their wives? Do you know? All barren. So whatever had to come by divine intervention through faith. Pointing to whom? The son of promise. Righteousness by faith. Through grace. Everything of God and nothing of man. How beautiful is that? Sure. Anyway. He says, and by your offspring seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. So in other words, God confirms his covenant with Isaac, the very son of promise. Now we get Jacob. We get Jacob, right? Again, who was Isaac's wife? Can you remember? Hey? Barren woman. Then gives birth to 2 sons. Who is? Jacob and Esau, right? The supplanter and the heel grabber who took his brother's blessing, right? His birthright. Who deceived his father into getting that birthright. But his wife was also barren. So she gives birth to 2 sons by faith through grace. And the one will become the father of that great nation. So we look further, he confirms that too through Jacob. Isaac had 2 sons, and God chose to confirm the covenant with Jacob, as seen in Genesis 28, verse 13 to 15. And behold, Jehovah stood above it and said, I am Jehovah, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. See what he does? How do we know we're dealing with the right people? Here he appears to Jacob and says, I'm the God of Abraham. And who again? Your father Isaac. And now I'm your God. And that's how we see God confirming the same covenant with this specific line. So I don't think there's much confusion about who is the true nation here, right? I'm sorry I'm laying a little bit of an emphasis on it because the video is going out. I am Jehovah, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac, the land whereupon you lie. Again, we get the land confirmed. You see that? Again, the land. To you will I give it, and to your seed, and to your seed shall be as the dust of the earth. He repeats himself. Exactly like he said to his father. And you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, the north and the south, and in you and in your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Now guess what he's doing? Again, your seed. Now it's unfortunate that we sometimes don't see the seed in capital letters or with the right emphasis, but we know who he's pointing to, right? I unfortunately haven't done the Hebrew translation for you, but I'm sure if I go back to it, I will prove to you that again, he's again through Jacob pointing to Christ, that through this line will come. Okay? What we see, I think, that's very important is the covenants and the promises go hand in hand. Because what we'll see in the prophecies, what we'll see in the prophecies is that as the prophets spoke, we see the particulars of the coming of the Messiah fulfilled through a people. Initially, we have a general promise of a Savior that will crush the serpent's head. Then we have a people chosen. Then we have a lineage and a nation forming. But the prophecies run parallel to this, telling us what to look for. Through which tribe? In what city? When? At what festival that the Lord will establish through these people will He come? What do we need to look for? What I need to show you is this, is that they had the covenants, the law, the sacrifices, and the temple and the priesthood, which all points to the same thing. They are the ones who preserved this truth faithfully, so that those who later see by the grace of the Spirit and believe could be grafted in and be saved. Do you see that? It's amazing to me. I just love it, and thank God for a nation that's been faithful and preserved the word so that by it we might live. Okay? So, let's go to the book of Acts chapter 3 verse 25. You are the descendants, the sons of the prophets, and the heirs of the covenant which God made and gave to your forefathers, saying to Abraham. Okay? So the New Testament, when they spoke to the Jewish people in the book of Acts in the New Testament, after the Spirit was poured out, He now addresses them and tells them, you are the descendants of the prophets and heirs of the covenant which God made and gave to your forefathers. Now specifically pointing to Abraham. So I want you to see the prophecies and the covenants go hand in hand. The one enlightens us to understand the other. Okay? And in your seed, saying to Abraham, and in your seed, heir, capital letter, shall all the families of the earth be blessed and benefited. It was to you first that God sent His servant and Son Jesus. Now we see in the New Testament a clear description of who that seed is and how the nations would be blessed through Him and how the Jewish nation would be blessed. Remember, when that Gentile woman came to Jesus who had the sick daughter, what did He say to her? I came for the lost tribe of Israel. I didn't come for you. I didn't come for the dogs. But her insistence in faith saved her daughter from destruction, which was a significant type. He first came to His own did not receive Him. And then He opened the banquet. He fulfilled what He promised to His people. He first came to them, but with the whole world in mind and in view, that those who are now cut off for our sakes, they'll be set aside, and those that believe and are willing to believe in what was promised here would be justified by faith. Am I making sense? Okay. Very interesting topic this. Now, again, Galatians 3 verse 8, and the scripture foreseeing that God would justify and declare righteous and put right standing with Himself the Gentiles in consequence of faith. Where does the scriptures foresee that? It foresees that in Abraham. Abraham believed God. He entered into a covenant with God. He was circumcised because of his faith, and after his faith and after he was declared righteous, he received circumcision as a sign of the covenant and justification before God. In the same way, it foresaw that Gentiles would come, believe in the same manner, circumcised by heart, and be set aside for the Lord. The Gentiles, in consequence of faith, proclaimed the gospel, foretelling the glad tidings of a Savior long beforehand to Abraham in the promise, saying, "In you shall all the nations of the earth be blessed." You know, I am so elated when I read this, because the scriptures make for you the link to the covenant made with Abraham and the good news of the gospel. Isn't that beautiful? Yes, it was to the Jew first. Yes, it was for the Jew specific. But for those who were willing to obey the God of the Jew, to believe the God of the Jew, they would be circumcised by heart because of their faith and be justified. And the good news was that seed was the message of the gospel that would go out to all the nations, and all would be able to benefit. Beautiful, hey? Now, in Genesis 49 verse 10, I think this is important. So we see the covenant confirmed. First, the covenant is made with Abraham, confirmed with Isaac, confirmed with Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. And now let's see what he says to the sons. I love this verse. The scepter of leadership shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. Until when? Until Shiloh, the Messiah, the peaceful one, comes, to whom it belongs. How do you love that verse? Now he confirms with these people that are out of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You have the 12 tribes. And he says, listen, the scepter of rulership shall not depart until the Messiah comes, to whom it rightfully belongs, and he rules over them. And to him shall be the obedience of the people. I want to show you something. When I did the doctrine of the Trinity, I mentioned something out of the Aramaic scriptures. Remember? What I mentioned there was that Christ made the covenant at Mount Sinai, and he gave the law. He was the one who gave the law, and he was the one who saved them from the consequence of it. Remember, I showed you that. Right, so now what is significant here is that he was always the one who stood in covenant with them, and there will come a day, according to this covenant he made with Abraham, where Christ will return to his people, and he will rule as rightful ruler over them, according to the covenant that they made with him from the beginning. Do you see that? I'm looking forward to that day. This is glorious to me. I don't know, when I read these scriptures, I get so filled with joy because I see it happening. I see everything being set up. Oh yes, it's getting darker. But guess what? After this darkness comes the light. It's there already. It will be revealed soon, and he will fulfill all these things. Listen carefully. The scepter of leadership shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh, the Messiah, the peaceful one, comes, to whom it belongs, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. He will rule then over whom? Jew and Gentile. So he confirms his covenant. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 tribes. Actually, the whole of Genesis 49, you find a number of confirmations of everything he promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You find it there. So please go read it. I could never put it in, otherwise the study will not come to an end. Galatians 3:16. Now the promise and the covenant and agreement were decreed and made to Abraham and his seed. Have a look there. Again, as confirmed previously in the book of Acts, seed is a singular capital letter, meaning his offspring or his heir. God does not say to seeds, that is multiple, descendants or heirs. multiple, as if referring to many people, but and to your seed, your descendant, your heir, singular, obviously referring to one individual who is none other than Christ the Messiah. Over and over it says the same thing. What did Abraham believe, and why was it counted to him as righteousness? He understood this thing, the seed of Abraham. Through you, the Messiah will come. I've chosen you, I've set you apart. So he picks a man, sets him apart, and now this whole plan of redemption will be fulfilled. He made a general promise to Adam in the garden, and he told the serpent, the seed of the woman will crush your head. There's going to be a consequence, right? But I will save. And then we see how this whole salvation is going to be fulfilled through choosing a particular, peculiar people. Now, let's look at it, and then we'll finish for tonight. The Abrahamic covenant becomes the basis of the dispensation of promise. Now remember, as I said, these dispensations might come to an end, but the fulfillment of the detail might be for a future age, and that's what we'll see tonight. Because the Abrahamic covenant is unconditional, right? The ultimate fulfillment will come during the kingdom age. Like I just read to you now, it confirms this covenant to the posterity of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but we see Shiloah has not yet come. He's not ruling yet. He's not rightfully taking his place as king over his people. It will come. Okay? In Exodus 2:23 we read the following. However, after a long time, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites were sighing and groaning because of the bondage. They kept crying, and their cry because of slavery ascended to God. Now watch. And God heard their sighing and groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. What do we learn from this? What do we learn from this? He again confirmed his covenant. He confirmed his covenant, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is a very, very significant prophetic future pointing word as well. He will again remember his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. His people are again under bondage. And because of that covenant, again he will remember and deliver them from slavery. I want you to see that. It was a fulfillment then, but it also has a future fulfillment. We know something very significant. Egypt is a type of the world. Right? And ultimately he will deliver his people out of the world because they surely messed up and in it. And he will deliver his remnant of his own people out of it for sure and establish his kingdom as promised to Abraham. Now, in Deuteronomy 34 verse 4 we read the following. And the Lord said to him, this is the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. Sorry. Who's he talking to? Moses. Right? And something significant is happening here. Again, we understand what is the spiritual meaning of it. Moses, significant of the Mosaic covenant and the law, could not take the people in. But who could? Joshua or Yeshua, pointing to Christ, by faith will take the people in. And so it will be at the end again, that by natural works they will not possess the land. But there will come a day when Yeshua will come, when they will acknowledge him and by him enter in. And we'll see this again as a future fulfillment. But the point is here, the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He keeps the confirmation of the covenant that he made with Abraham. All right, we're out of time for this evening, but I want you to keep the following in mind. All these covenants are connected with dispensations, although we do not cling strictly to dispensationalism, because some of the conditions of the covenant are yet to be fulfilled. Some of these covenants are everlasting covenants and will come to an end when the Messiah returns. Right? What we need to understand, God relates to His people through covenants. When the Lord enters into a covenant, we keep in mind His character and integrity. He is eternal, transcendent, outside of time, space, and matter. He cannot lie. He fulfills everything He has promised. Numbers 23:19 says, God is not a man that He should lie, nor a son of man that He should repent. Has He said anything, and will He not do it? He will keep His word. Literally by the fact that He has kept portions of these covenants, you should know that He will keep the rest. There are divine timelines and reasons for why everything is not fulfilled immediately. What we further need to see is that although these covenants now hones in on the Jews specifically, God always had salvation by grace through faith in view. He always had salvation for all nations in mind. Right? He always had the same redemptive plan for all of us. Although the scriptures clearly says to the Jew first and then to the Gentile, we see why He does that. We have no problem with Him picking a peculiar people, and we have no problem with Him restoring that peculiar people at the end of the age and making them the royal priesthood He always intended for them to be, and being the king over them, and to all those who have the same faith. No, Gentiles are not excluded. By grace they are included. And we see that clearly confirmed later in the New Testament. To me, the covenant's essential message is around the seed of the woman, the promised seed of Abraham, and the coming Messiah. Both the first and the second time. All right. Thank you.